So a lot of people get confused about whether a financial transaction is actually going to make it into GDP or not. And so that's the entire point of this video, is just to decide. I'm just going to walk you through some examples and we're going to decide whether or not this is in GDP. So first I just wanted to go ahead and reiterate the kind of verbatim textbook definition of GDP, which is the market value, so this is important, of all final goods and services, this is important, produced within a country, also important, during a given time period, and that's normally a year. So every single part of this really is critical, and I've tried to make up examples that will hit kind of every single part. So a car that is manufactured in the United States but sold in Canada, will that make it into USA's GDP? So will that make it into American GDP? And the answer is that it will. It's a final good, it's a car, produced within America. It's manufactured in the USA. And so it doesn't matter where it's sold, it will make it into American GDP. So this is a yes, it's in GDP. So next, will wheat that is grown in the USA and sold to a miller in the USA to make flour be included in American GDP? And the answer here is no, it's not in GDP. And the reason is that this is not a final good. If wheat is being used to make flour, it is an intermediate good. So when the miller goes ahead and sells that flour, that would be in GDP. But the wheat itself is not in GDP because it's not a final good. It's an intermediate good. In other words, it's a good that is being used to produce another good. So I hope that that's clear. Next, we have an American professor that gets paid $100,000 to teach in Panama. So is that in American GDP? And I should have just specified that all of these are American GDP. So the answer here is that this is not in GDP because he's teaching in Panama. This would be in Panamanian GDP. So even though the professor is American, he's an American citizen, he is working in Panama. So this is not his teaching is a final service, but it is not produced within America. It's produced within Panama. So this will be in Panamanian GDP. This will not be in American GDP. And then I just decided to flip this around and say a Panamanian professor gets paid $100,000 to teach in the USA. Will that be in American GDP? And I think that you can figure out that this will be in GDP, because even though he is of Panamanian nationality, he is teaching in the USA. So this is, his teaching is a final service that is produced within the USA, so it will be in American GDP, and it is during a given time period. Lastly, I need to say that the market value is 100,000, so we have a market value. And we just assumed in these first two that there was a market value, but I should have probably said a car manufactured in the USA but sold in Canada for, 30,000 Canadian dollars. And I should have said that wheat was grown in the USA and sold for a price, but that was kind of assumed that it was sold in a market. So that is all that I want to say about whether things are in GDP or not. It's really just really careful to think about it's really important to be really careful and think about every part of this definition when you go to try and figure out whether a transaction is included in GDP or not.